Have you ever looked at a portrait where the subject is perfectly sharp, but the background melts into a beautiful blur? Or maybe you've wondered why your phone seems to keep everything in focus, while professional portraits have that soft, dreamy look. Many people think aperture is simply the setting that creates background blur. But that's only part of the story. Aperture is actually one of the most powerful creative tools in photography because it controls two things at the same time. It controls how much light enters your camera, and it controls how much of your photograph appears in focus. Understanding aperture is one of the biggest steps toward moving from taking snapshots to creating photographs with intention. Imagine you're standing in a dark room with a window. If the window is only slightly open, very little light can enter. The room stays dark. Now imagine opening that window as wide as possible. Suddenly the room fills with light. A camera works in exactly the same way. Instead of a window, your lens contains an opening called the aperture. The wider that opening becomes, the more light reaches the camera's sensor. The smaller the opening becomes, the less light reaches the sensor. It really is that simple. This opening is measured using something called the f-stop. At first, these numbers seem backwards. An aperture of f/1.4 is actually a very large opening. An aperture of f/2 is slightly smaller. f/4 is smaller again. By the time you reach f/16, the opening has become quite small. So here's the important thing to remember. Small number, large opening, large number, small opening. It feels confusing at first, but after using your camera a few times, it becomes second nature. Now let's look at what photographers love most about aperture: depth of field. This simply means how much of your photograph appears acceptably sharp. Imagine you're photographing a person. At f/14, perhaps only their eyes are perfectly sharp. Their ears begin to soften, the background becomes beautifully blurred. The viewer's attention immediately goes to the subject. Now imagine changing your aperture to f/16. Suddenly, the person's face, the trees behind them, the mountains in the distance, and even the clouds can all appear sharp. Nothing else changed. Only the size of the opening inside the lens, yet the entire feel of the photograph changed. So when should you use a large aperture? Portrait photographers often choose wide apertures because they separate the subject from the background. Wedding photographers use them to create soft, romantic images. Wildlife photographers use them to isolate animals from busy surroundings. But sometimes you want exactly the opposite. If you're photographing a landscape, you usually want everything from the foreground to the distant horizon to be sharp. In that case, you'll often use a much smaller aperture. Neither choice is right or wrong. The best aperture is simply the one that tells your story. Here's something many beginners don't realize. The most blurred background doesn't automatically create the best photograph. If one eye is sharp but the other eye is out of focus, the image may actually feel distracting. Sometimes using f/2.8 instead of f/1.4 creates a stronger portrait because more of the face remains sharp while the background still stays soft. Photography isn't about using the widest aperture possible. It's about choosing the aperture that best serves your subject. Here's a simple exercise. Find one object, a coffee mug, a flower, or even your favorite camera. Place it on a table. Take the same photograph at f/2.8, then f/5/6, then f/8, then f/11. Compare them side by side. Notice how the background gradually becomes sharper as the aperture gets smaller. There's no better way to understand aperture than seeing it with your own eyes. Remember this: aperture is not just a technical setting, it's a storytelling tool. A wide aperture tells the viewer exactly where to look. A narrow aperture invites them to explore the entire scene. Master aperture, and you'll begin making creative decisions instead of simply taking pictures. In our next lesson, we'll explore shutter speed, the setting that allows you to freeze a hummingbird's wings, capture the movement of a waterfall, or create dramatic motion blur with a single click of the shutter.